Have you ever noticed how loud the world has become? Notifications buzzing, opinions flying, pressure mounting. And somewhere in all that noise, we lose the one thing that truly matters ourselves. What if the peace you're looking for isn't in a vacation, a new job, or someone else's approval, but in mastering one simple, powerful practice? Today, we're going to talk about the underrated superpower of our time, a still mind, and how it leads to a life you don't need to escape from, a serene life. We often associate clarity with answers, something we go out and find, like a lost key or a missing file. But clarity doesn't live in the noise of our search. It doesn't show up when we're in a rush to make sense of everything. It reveals itself when we stop chasing and begin listening. True clarity comes not from more effort, but from more stillness. Most of us are trained to respond immediately. Emails, texts, opinions, we treat them all as urgent. So we react. Quickly, emotionally, automatically. But reaction isn't clarity. Reaction is just a habit. Stillness, on the other hand, creates the space for reflection. And reflection is where clarity begins. When the mind is still, we can step back and see not just what's in front of us, but what it means. Imagine a muddy glass of water. If you keep stirring it, the water never clears. But if you let it sit, the particles settle, and suddenly, what was cloudy becomes transparent. The mind works the same way. Constant stimulation keeps everything murky. Stillness allows thoughts to settle, and in that settling, the truth becomes visible. Clarity isn't a forceful act. It's not a mental muscle we flex to squeeze out answers. It's more like a sunrise. It happens when the conditions are right. When we slow down, when we breathe deeply, when we step back from the endless loop of doing, thinking, comparing, that's when clarity shows up uninvited, like a quiet friend who's been waiting patiently for us to notice them. We live in a culture that values speed. Speed is impressive. Speed looks like progress. But speed can also blur vision. We move so fast trying to get ahead that we forget to look around, or worse, to look within. Stillness feels like a pause, but in reality, it's an acceleration toward understanding. Because when you know where you're going, you don't have to rush. In stillness, patterns emerge. We begin to notice what we've been ignoring. We recognize our own habits, our hidden fears, the loops we've been stuck in. And with recognition comes the power to change. You can't change what you can't see. Stillness sharpens sight. It's how we move from confusion to insight, from noise to meaning. The people who seem the most clear in life, they're not necessarily the smartest or the loudest. They're the ones who've learned how to be still. They've stopped fighting for every answer and started trusting the process of listening. They're not looking for clarity, they're creating the conditions in which clarity can emerge. Stillness also teaches us the difference between what's urgent and what's important. In a noisy mind, everything feels critical. But when the mind is calm, we can finally distinguish between the voice of fear and the voice of intuition, between pressure and purpose, between what's loud and what's true. When we're still, our thoughts stop fighting for dominance. Instead, they line up, reveal their intent, and allow us to choose the ones that align with who we are. Clarity isn't about having fewer thoughts, it's about finally understanding which ones matter. That discernment only comes when we stop long enough to observe them without judgment. Stillness is the space between the question and the answer. It's not passive, it's powerful. It's not the absence of thought, it's the presence of perspective. And it's in that space, that pause, where clarity is no longer something we seek. It becomes something we carry. There's a kind of noise we all recognize: the honking horns, the scrolling headlines, the endless chatter. But then, there's a subtler kind, the internal kind, the kind that shows up even when the room is quiet. It's the to-do lists looping in our minds, the imagined arguments we never had, the self-doubt disguised as planning. This is the noise that truly steals our peace, and most of us carry it everywhere. We've become so used to noise that silence now feels uncomfortable. It's why we fill every quiet second with a screen, a scroll, or a sound. We're addicted to distraction because distraction feels like control. But control isn't the same as calm. Control is reactive. Peace is responsive. And you can't respond wisely when you're buried under layers of noise. Noise convinces us we're being productive, that we're staying informed, staying ahead, staying connected. But peace doesn't need a constant feed of input. Peace comes from creating distance, from choosing what deserves our attention, rather than giving it away by default. Noise is what happens when we stop choosing and start absorbing without thought. The tragedy of modern life isn't that we're too busy. It's that we're too noisy. We mistake stimulation for satisfaction. We equate being in the loop with being in control. And somewhere in that chaos, we lose the quiet inner knowing that tells us what truly matters. Peace isn't found in the absence of movement. It's found in the absence of unnecessary motion. The truth is, we're afraid of silence. Silence feels uncertain. It reveals things we've buried. In silence, we hear the doubts we've avoided, the dreams we've ignored, the truths we've postponed. Noise helps us hide. But peace only lives in the places where nothing is hiding. It requires exposure, and exposure requires courage. We often think we need more time. But what we really need is less noise in the time we already have. We don't need an extra hour, we need 10 quiet minutes. Because peace isn't created by adding more, but by subtracting what's not serving us. It's not about finding a better playlist, a more relaxing app, or a perfect routine. It's about creating a relationship with quiet itself. Every decision we make is shaped by the quality of our inner world. And if that inner world is full of noise, doubt, comparison, urgency, then no external solution will ever bring relief. Noise leads us to chase the next fix. Peace invites us to pause, to look at what's already within reach, and most importantly, to listen. Noise is often disguised as urgency. A message we must reply to. A task we must finish. A trend we must follow. But urgency without clarity leads to burnout, not progress. Peace doesn't come from avoiding responsibilities. It comes from meeting them with a centered mind. And you can't find your center while being pulled in every direction. We believe we're missing out if we disconnect. But the real thing we're missing is the present moment. That's the cost of noise. It robs us of now, of that sacred pause between experiences, of the deep breath before the next move. We think we're living more when we're tuned into everything, but in truth, we're absorbing so much that we stop actually feeling any of it. Peace requires us to choose differently, to build boundaries where noise used to flow freely, to say no to what doesn't align, to let go of the fear of missing out and embrace the joy of being present. But we can't do that if we don't first acknowledge how loud it's gotten in here. Not out there in here, in the spaces no one else can hear but us. We grow up believing that control is power, that if we just plan enough, work hard enough, anticipate every variable, we can shape the world to fit our expectations. But no matter how tightly we hold the reins, the world doesn't follow our script. Plans fall through, people change, life interrupts, and in those moments, we're forced to face a truth we spend most of our time avoiding. We don't control what happens around us. We only control how we respond. Most frustration comes from the gap between expectation and reality. We expect calm and get chaos. We expect understanding and get criticism. We expect progress and get delay. And when that gap widens, we tend to fill it with blame directed at the world, at others, even at ourselves. But blame doesn't create peace. It just deepens the noise. Response, however, is where real power begins to emerge. Response is different from reaction. A reaction is instinctual. It's fast, loud, emotional. It's our inner world spilling out unfiltered. A response, though that's conscious. It's measured. It's chosen. It requires a pause. And in that pause is everything. Maturity, presence, responsibility. The space between what happens and what we do about it is where peace lives. The mistake many of us make is assuming that if we can just fix everything out there, we'll finally feel okay in here. So we try to control conversations, outcomes, other people's opinions. But peace doesn't come from rearranging the external. It comes from rearranging the internal. When we realize we don't need to control everything, we just need to choose who we're going to be in the face of it, that's when things begin to change. Some of the calmest people you'll ever meet are not the ones who've had easy lives. They're the ones who've faced storms and learned to breathe through them. They've stopped wishing the waves were smaller and started becoming better sailors. Their strength doesn't come from life being gentle. It comes from them choosing not to be consumed by every wave. The truth is, the world will always test us. Traffic will jam. Projects will fail. People will disappoint. But the test isn't in the event, it's in the moment after. The moment when we decide whether to escalate or ground ourselves. Whether to add to the chaos or bring calm. Whether to reflect or to react. That decision is where all our influence lies. Response is a practice. It doesn't come naturally, especially in a culture that rewards quick comebacks and emotional overdrive. But like any skill, it can be trained. It begins with noticing, catching yourself in that split-second moment where emotion rises and asking, what am I about to hand over to this moment? My wisdom or my wounds? We can't control how people speak to us. But we can choose to listen without absorbing. We can't control whether today brings ease or difficulty. But we can bring presence to either. We can't control whether the world is noisy. But we can lower our own volume. And sometimes, that's the most radical thing we can do: be calm in a world that thrives on urgency. Leadership, at its core, is about response. Not about power over others, but power within ourselves. It's about being the thermostat, not the thermometer, setting the emotional tone rather than reflecting it. That kind of leadership doesn't need titles. It's felt in families, friendships, classrooms, and conversations. It's the quiet presence of someone who knows they don't need to control the storm, they just need to anchor themselves within it. There's freedom in accepting what's out of your hands. Not because you've given up, but because you've leveled up. Because you've learned that peace doesn't come from changing the weather. It comes from changing how you walk through the rain. We often treat peace like a destination. Something will arrive at once life finally slows down. Once we get through this busy week. Once we've handled the latest issue. But stillness doesn't come when the world settles, it comes when we do. It's not an event we stumble upon. It's a practice we build. One quiet choice, made again and again. Discipline isn't a word we usually associate with peace. We connect it with structure, rules, control. But the kind of discipline stillness requires isn't rigid. It's intentional. It's not about controlling every moment, it's about creating enough space within the moment to experience it fully. Stillness isn't something we find, it's something we create on purpose. Most people wait until they're burned out to seek stillness. Until their mind is overwhelmed. Until their body is exhausted. Until life forces a pause they never gave themselves willingly. But what if stillness wasn't a rescue mission, but a daily ritual? What if it wasn't a last resort, but a lifestyle? That shift changes everything. The truth is, we don't drift into peace. We drift into noise, into distraction, into stimulation. Stillness requires navigation. It asks us to be awake, aware, and deliberate. And that kind of presence doesn't happen by accident. It happens through small, consistent choices, the kind most people overlook, because they don't feel dramatic enough to matter. Stillness can look incredibly ordinary. It's the 10-minute walk without your phone. It's saying no to a conversation that drains you. It's taking 3 deep breaths before responding to a frustrating message. It's pausing before the next task, even when your calendar says, go. These moments don't make headlines, but they make a difference. And like any form of discipline, stillness often feels inconvenient, especially in a world that measures worth in how much you can juggle. But stillness isn't about stopping everything, it's about stopping the excess. It's the discipline of not letting urgency hijack your clarity, of not letting everyone else's noise become your inner soundtrack. There's a misconception that stillness is the absence of movement. But often, it's movement with intention. It's knowing what not to carry, what not to answer, what not to engage. It's the quiet power of being deeply rooted in yourself, so deeply, you don't have to chase everything to feel like you're enough. Some days, stillness will feel effortless. Other days, it'll feel like swimming upstream. But that's the nature of discipline. It's not about what we feel like doing, it's about what we choose to do, even when the feeling isn't there. Especially when it isn't there. Because it's in those moments that the practice strengthens. You can't binge your way into a still life. You can't do it once and expect it to hold. It has to be cultivated like a garden, daily, with patience, with pruning, with presence. And even then, weeds of distraction will grow back. The work is not in preventing them, it's in returning gently to the practice again. Stillness, when built as a discipline, becomes something more than quiet, it becomes a compass. It points you back to yourself. It reminds you that chaos is a condition of the world, not a requirement of your mind. But that reminder doesn't last forever on its own. It needs to be revisited, reinforced, relearned every single day. We often look at relationships as something we build with others. But the truth is, every relationship begins with the one we have with ourselves. The tone of our mind, the way we speak to ourselves, handle our thoughts, manage our emotions becomes the tone we bring into every interaction. A still mind doesn't just feel better, it shows up better. When our mind is cluttered, so are our conversations. We hear what people say, but we filter it through fear, insecurity, or past hurt. We respond to what they triggered, not what they meant. And suddenly, small moments turn into unnecessary tension. Stillness allows us to hear with clarity, not just to respond, but to understand. Stillness gives us the power to listen without preparing our defense. It removes the urge to win and replaces it with a willingness to connect. Because in a still mind, ego doesn't have to dominate. Silence isn't seen as weakness, and validation isn't needed to feel seen. We're already grounded enough in ourselves that we don't need to be loud to feel heard. A person with a still mind doesn't need to fix every discomfort in a conversation. They don't rush to interrupt silence. They know that sometimes, the most healing thing you can offer another person is your presence, not your opinion, not your solution, just presence. That presence becomes a safe space others can feel, often without even knowing why. When you're at peace with yourself, you stop expecting others to give you what you haven't yet given yourself. You no longer depend on someone else's mood to stabilize your own. You stop assigning responsibility to others for emotions that are yours to carry. And that shift transforms every dynamic, from the boardroom to the living room. Relationships begin to feel different when you stop showing up out of need and start showing up out of wholeness. You begin to ask better questions. You listen without trying to impress. You communicate without manipulation. You're no longer performing for acceptance, you're participating out of presence. And people feel that deeply. A still mind doesn't make you passive in relationships. It makes you intentional. You don't ignore red flags, but you don't react to every flicker of discomfort either. You give space for clarification before assuming the worst. You respond with curiosity instead of accusation. Because stillness isn't silence, it's self-control. When we carry chaos inside, we often unconsciously look for others to manage it for us. We expect them to calm us, to reassure us, to fix what we haven't sat with ourselves. But when our mind is still, we take back that responsibility. We enter relationships not to be completed, but to be mirrored, to grow, to share, not to be rescued. A still mind doesn't fear being alone, which means it also doesn't cling when it shouldn't. It respects boundaries, its own and others. It knows the difference between connection and attachment, between comfort and codependence, and it trusts that the right relationships don't require noise to feel alive. They rest in mutual understanding, in gentle presence, in calm energy. Peaceful people become magnets, not because they're perfect, but because they're safe. In a world where everyone's trying to be heard louder, stillness becomes an invitation. It tells others, you don't need to be dramatic to be seen here. You don't need to pretend. You don't need to fight for space. There's already room for you, exactly as you are. A still mind doesn't mean an empty one. It means a disciplined one. A mind that knows when to hold on and when to let go. A mind that doesn't chase every sound, every thought, every emotion that passes through. It means choosing clarity over chaos, response over reaction, depth over distraction. We live in a world that glorifies movement faster, louder, busier. But life isn't just about how much we do. It's about how we carry ourselves as we do it. And that begins in the unseen places, the quiet spaces, the pauses we protect, the boundaries we build, the thoughts we question before believing them. Stillness isn't a luxury. It's not something you earn once everything is in order. It's the very thing that helps you create order within, not around you. Because clarity doesn't scream, peace doesn't rush, and wisdom doesn't interrupt. They arrive when we've learned how to be still enough to recognize them. No matter how loud the world becomes, your response remains your power. Stillness makes that power accessible, not just for your own peace, but for the peace you extend to others. A still mind becomes a still presence, and a still presence creates space for truth, for healing, for connection, for life. So if you want a serene life, don't wait for the world to quiet down. Begin by quieting yourself, not just once, not just when it's easy, but daily, gently, intentionally, because a still mind is not a destination. It's a way of walking, and the way we walk through life will always shape what life feels like.